today's panel discussion, which is a surprise panel discussion for all of you, and so it's about when Raja Raj Chola met Akbar, writing about the great kings from non-historian POV. We have our moderator, Amit Basole. He's an author, poet, expert on the work of Ghalib. If I'm saying, I don't know if I'm saying it right. Am I saying it right?
That is fine,
You're not a poet? Oh, you might as well be. So he's an author, poet, expert on the work of Ghalib. With a PhD in economics, he has combined his love for Ghalib's poetry with his academic expertise to bring a fresh and unique perspective to Ghalib's work in his book, Thinking with Ghalib, Poetry for a New Generation. The book is a must-read for anyone looking to understand Ghalib's poetry in depth and appreciation of the culture and historical context in which it was written. Coming to our author's introductions, Parvati Sharma is an expert in the non-historian era who writes fascinating, deeply researched non-fiction narratives on the main characters or players of the Mughal dynasty in India. Babur, Akbar and Jahangir come alive for us as men of complexities and character, and not just as men written in subcontinental history. Delhi-based journalist Parvati Sharma is a Stefaninian, columnist with the Hindu Business Line and the go-to person for an authentic understanding of the Mughal dynasty. Coming to our author number 2 in the panel, Kamini Dandapani was born and raised in once sleepy Madras. She now lives in the city that never sleeps, New York, baby. She has extensive training in Carnatic music, Bharatanatyam, and Western classical music. A longer than desired stint in the corporate world that included Chase Manhattan Bank and McKinsey & Co. was followed by a complete change in direction back to her true loves, top among which are music and writing. And I'm so glad to let you know that we're gonna have a beautiful session with the topic When Raja Raj Chola Met Akbar. So let's have a huge round of applause for our panelists and moderator. May I please request our moderator to usher the authors on stage.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this very, very impromptu session. So it's, you should generally never give anyone any idea unless you're prepared to do the work. So I learned my lesson. I just thought it would be a very nice opportunity. Two wonderful authors here who both happen to have written a book each about a big king, a famous king, an emperor, and who are both not historians, self-avowedly so. So, we thought it'd be a nice conversation to have on what does it like to write history of these great men who have these legacies, very contested legacies, politically very charged, and both of them happen to be like that. Hopefully that will also come out in the conversation. But also just writing about these difficult, often undersourced, or the sources are, you have to read against the grain, many things have to be done. Many of us who just listen to these stories don't understand the work involved in actually presenting the stories. Right? So I was hoping also to get some of that out. What is it like to, when you're not trained in that craft necessarily as a historian? So I won't say much more. Let me just start by exactly that question, and then we'll come to the more difficult stuff later. So the same question to both of you. What made you care enough about this to want to do all the hard work that is required in presenting such stories? And then if you could describe the nature of the work itself a little bit. So we'll start with you, Kamini, and then we'll come to.
Okay, so if I think of the 15 or 20 or 25 or even 30-year-old me, I would never have dreamed that I would have written a book, leave alone on history. History was my least favorite subject in school, largely because how it was taught, and also its reputation was that it was a subject that those who didn't get into medicine or engineering or law took up. It was a subject for losers, so it was just there. But I was just fortunate that my father was passionate about history, and he used to keep talking about these things, Cholas, Pallavas, and I was like, whatever. And I think in all of us, there is a seed that comes alive at some stage in life. It comes alive at a different point for all of us. When you suddenly realize your interest in your own history is revived, it just comes alive. And that happened to me. And I started a blog about 15 years ago called Tales of South India, where I traveled to places and wrote about the history of the places I visited, whether it was temples or towns or dynasties, and I found that really, really interesting. And it was a kind of a fairy tale story for me, because my publishers, I guess somebody got a look at it and they saw it and said, would you write a history of the Cholas? And I said, I'm not a historian, you're asking the wrong person. And they said, no, we're asking you precisely because you're not a historian. We want something written that would appeal to any of us here, so something that is for a lay reader, something that is not academic and scholarly. So I said, okay, because it's hard to say no to something like that. And I think I spent a year in just panic. Like, what have I let myself into? What am I going to do? How am I going to start? And that is the most difficult part. How am I going to start? So, and I will paraphrase Newton here and say I have stood on the shoulders of giants who did a lot of amazing work before me, and that was my foundation stone. So there is a lot of academic research on the Cholas. There's one called The Cholas by Neelakanta Shastri that is nearly 100 years old at this point. And there's also a lot of very specialized academic research on different aspects of Chola lives, like the bronzes, the temples, their organization, their trade, yes, all meant for academic or specialized audiences. So I kind of waded through that, went down numerous rabbit holes, some of which led somewhere, some of which led nowhere. And, and slowly I started getting a picture of an idea of what I wanted to write about. Now, the wonderful surprise so being a non-historian, I started on a blank slate. So I had no preconceived notions, it just kind of evolved organically. And an amazing, wonderful surprise I learned about the Cholas was that they were master inscribers. They inscribed everything on their temple walls, and most of it is like very, very boring, but they probably had a sense of history. So not only their military victories, but also donations to temples, who donated them, what was donated, so many sheep, so many lamps. So you wade through all this mass of stuff, and you sort of step back and you get a picture of what it's about. So the research was very, very tedious, and you kind of have to read a lot of stuff that doesn't make it to the book, but it was also ultimately very rewarding. And I think being a non-historian just gives you a fresh perspective. You just look at it as you look at it, without any things that this is how it is meant to be interpreted and this is what, you just do it. I might be all wrong in what I've written, but this is what I felt, and so that's how it was for me.
Well, it's very true. We do stand on the shoulders of giants. I think it would be impossible to write these books without the people who have written about these subjects before us. And as to what led me to Jahangir and then Akbar, I would say in two words, I would say Chiki Sarkar, my publisher. I was working on a book of fiction, and I was it was toward the final draft. It was almost done, and then Chiki said there was something in it that wasn't quite working. So I went to meet her to have to discuss what it was, and she was right. There were some things that needed more work, and as I was leaving, this novel contained, one of the characters was a historian, and at one point he's a historian of pre-modern medieval Indian history, and he gives a little talk on Akbar and Aurangzeb, as it happens, and Chiki, I think, had liked that very much. And as I was at the door, I can remember the scene. I mean, my hand was on the door. I was leaving. She said, "Why don't you take a break from this and write something about Jahangir, like a history of Jahangir." And I went back home and I started reading the Jahangir Nama. And one of the things that a writer of fiction is always in search of is a good character. And Jahangir was just the most fascinating
and how
character.
Inspiring this can be. With your permission, can I read a line from your book to our readers?
I apologize
Yes.
because there's some glitch going on and only in our hall. It's a good thing that we get to learn from everywhere. So let's take it in a good way. And please continue, ma'am. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. And so the Jahangir, you start reading, and it's a very readable book, the Jahangir Nama, and within a few pages, he's talking about, having ordered the assassination of Abul Fazl, or, his own, famously, his addiction to drink, and, he says that I had my first drink when I was 18, and then really never looked back. By the time he was 30, he was drinking, I think it's like 14 goblets of double distilled liquor in a day. His hands would shake so much he wouldn't be able to hold the goblet. The doctor tells him, if you continue like this, you'll be dead in 6 months. And so he then heroically and very flamboyantly, he cuts down on his drinking by diluting that liquor with wine, if you please. So so this man was just, he was just so fascinating, and also such a good writer that I thought, okay, well, let me try, and it was a wonderful process. But one of the things I learned during the time, and I think I was lucky that I started with Jahangir, because the sources on him are limited. There is the Jahangir Nama, which is a very rich source because it's written by himself, so you really get a sense of the person. And then there are some contemporary sources like Thomas Rowe's journal and other travelers who've come here, but by and large the writing he's so overshadowed mostly by Akbar, but also by Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, that very little work has been done on him. So there was not too much that I had to read, but what I did have to read was very rich. But what I realized in the process is that while writing non-fiction and fiction are two very different skills, they both require a kind of skepticism. Even as a novelist, when you're writing fiction, you cannot get carried away by your own characters, even if you've invented them. If you become too much on any one character's side, then they stop being real. They lose the grace that make them human. And similarly, in when writing about historical characters, and certainly historical characters as complicated as these, kings were, you have to maintain a certain level of skepticism. And trust nobody is the motto that I developed while researching this, because everyone has a reason for writing what they're writing. And, even Jahangir in this, in the Jahangir Nama, which, because he's a very good writer, when you read it, it comes across as very, very unself-conscious. He's talking about being drunk, ordering assassinations, or whatever it is, these kind of things. So you think, oh, this man is just writing in a sort of free-flowing style. But there is a calculation somewhere, so there's this one story about, it's a very small example of him talking about Salim Chishti, famously that he was born as a result of Salim Chishti's prayers. And then he tells this other story of how actually Salim Chishti in turn dies as a result of Jahangir, because Akbar at one point, it seems, asks Salim Chishti that, I don't know why he feels the need to ask him, he says, when will you die? And Salim Chishti says, when this child, that is Salim, Jahangir, speaks his first words. So, for several years, 2.5 years, there's this great, he's like a cursed prince in a fairy tale. He's not to be taught how to recite something. But then one day a nurse comes into his nursery, and he's 2.5 years old, and she's reciting some poetry. He learns it off by heart. He goes and recites it, and lo and behold, Salim Chishti falls ill. Then Akbar goes to the Sufi's bedside. He takes Jahangir with him, and Jahangir says that as he lay dying, he took his turban and put it on my head, and he said, "You are, my true heir." And so that there are different ways of reading this. One is you could just say, well, he's just telling some story, like that Jahangir Nama is just full of anecdotes, right? But another way, and this is and this is, standing on the shoulders of giants. There's a modern historian called Corinne Lefebvre, has recently published a whole book on Jahangir. At the time, she had written a couple of very, very insightful essays re-examining the Jahangir Nama, in which she had said that, the Jahangir Nama is she calls it, I'm quoting, a model of imperial propaganda. And, so if you think of it like that, then you see, well, this is what Jahangir is not just telling her story, he is consciously, if subtly, positioning himself as not just the political heir to Akbar, but a spiritual heir to the Chishtis, to Salim Chishti. And that kind of spiritual power is also very important in ruling over the empire. So, that kind of, and that I think is one of the that's great fun of writing history, that you never know who's doing what for what reason and why.
No, I totally agree with you, and I find it fascinating because I didn't know the story, but the Cholas too were masters at, public relations, image creation, chest thumping, and you have to read everything they said about themselves with that lens, because they were conquering territories that were not part of their, core domain or their hereditary domain. They were incorporating, tribes and dynasties and clans into their region that were not part of theirs. So how do you validate that? How do you justify that? So you make these larger-than-life claims that you're descended from none less than the sun, and you have this glittering array of kings and gods and sages that were your ancestors that you have descended from, and you are the heir of this grand legacy. It's really fascinating to read that. You obviously do not take that at face value, but you say, why are they saying these things? And it's exactly, obviously nothing much has changed, from Rajaraja to Akbar and Jahangir, but it's really fascinating, and nothing has changed today also. You look at a modern corporation or even a government and how they speak about the things they say about themselves are not, it's just how you want the world to perceive you, and you need to be aware of that and, kind of step back and also say, wow, these guys were smart. And
I should add in this respect just what you said about things changing or not changing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But just as backdrop, maybe I should have mentioned that there's about as many years between Rajaraj Chola and Akbar as between Akbar and us. Okay, so sometimes we don't kind of think of these long expanses, but there's about 500 years between each of those, roughly speaking. And certainly, as is already coming out, there are certain big themes of power and legitimacy and seeking legitimacy, constructing it, that don't change in some meta sense. Of course, the particularities do change. We'll come to that in just a minute, but one thing that very interesting that came out, right, and I want you to also kind of maybe say a little bit more about this, is what I find really fascinating about these kinds of takes, and there have been many such popular history takes recently, is that it's making the person come alive too. And a lot of us who have read history in an academic sense, the nuance doesn't come from the personal angle. It comes from other things. Let's read against the grain. Let's not take sources at face value, or let's not, in temple desecration, there's all these other things going on, and so forth. But this here is really bringing the nuance of the person. Right? And I wanted both of you to say a little bit about how does that work today when the tendency is to want to put these great men in these boxes. So there are heroes and villains that you talked about. There's sort of the good Muslim equals Akbar, bad Muslim equals Aurangzeb, huge narrative that goes on. In Tamil country, there is a huge kind of Chola fascination to of course, there are other Tamil kings and so on who are there, and that's somehow disappears. Tamil nationalism becomes about Cholas. So does the personalization do anything, you think, to counter this, or is it really too powerful a force on that other side? Maybe we can start with you.
Should I start? Yes, like he said, in Tamil country, Rajaraja is this perfect, he's a perfect man, he's completely unflawed, he's his greatest king, which is ridiculous. And I think in thinking of them like this, as black and white, this good guy, bad guy thing, is doing them a disservice, is doing history a disservice, is doing the human race a disservice. Nobody is all bad and nobody is all good. And in fact, in speaking of his flaws and speaking of his giant ego and his, he had this burning ambition, and his thing for revenge was something else, The smallest slight seemed to enrage him, and he'd go off and, send his army somewhere and they'd burn down everything. So it's makes you appreciate him better. Rajaraja is not a man I would want to have dinner with as a dinner companion, but I sit back and I admire, and you have to understand why they did what he did. So I think it's important to remove him from that perch, that pedestal of this great Tamil hero, and bring him down to earth. And you're not lessening him in any way, but you're making him, a more interesting human being, I think. So there have been a lot of interest, like he said, in Tamil country about Rajaraja. There's a movie that has just come out called Ponniyin Selvan, that is a fictionalized version of the Cholas. And there's been idiotic debates that have cropped up about whether they were Hindu or not. And the whole thing just misses the point. None of it matters, because you're putting your modern mindset, your modern agenda, all that into issues to a time where this was not what they thought about. So, yes, presenting them as human beings, I think, does them a service, and as opposed to lessening them and bringing them down to earth. And they were human. Rajaraja and Akbar and Jahangir were as human as any of us, but they had bigger ambitions and bigger egos, and I guess bigger facilities, and that they achieved what they did against great odds is what we need to admire them for. So.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. When I think I was working on the second draft of this Akbar book, and I read a book by this French author called Patrick Deville. And unfortunately, there's only one of his books that is translated into English. It's called Plague and Cholera. But he's written this whole series of biographies, and he calls them novels without fiction. And that's quite literally, they are biographies of people from across the world. They are written with every sort of novelistic trope and style. They're very, very richly detailed, but all the details are fact and verified. And at one point, he says in this book, Plague and Cholera, he says, writing the life of a man is like playing the violin with the score in front of you. And I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it, because you have the music. You cannot deviate from that. Is the music that you're going to play is right in front of you. The notes are all there. But how you play them is what you can control. And so certainly that is, for somebody who's not a historian but a writer, that is the joy of it, to play that music in the way that you find most enjoyable. And as to what you said, about raising Rajaraja Chola to a pedestal, I think partly that is something that has happened across our history. Almost all our historical figures stand on pedestals. Perhaps the only one who doesn't is this Aurangzeb. He's the one villain. Like off the top of my head, I can only think of him. And I was listening to something by this Irish historian, someone called Tony King, a little while ago. I just happened to come across it, and he was sort of distinguishing between various kinds of histories, so academic histories, personal histories, then nationalist histories. And nationalist histories of a certain kind are certainly benign, in the sense that they are creating a nation as our nation was created, for which you need, good kings and the occasional good queen, all working heroically, from the Harappan age onwards, it seems, towards the creation of the modern nation state. That just to put it very simplistically, it seems to go that way. And then, the fourth kind of history he talks about is politically motivated history, which is more often than not divisive. And that's when this complicating and humanizing of these kings, I think, plays some role, because to go from pedestal to demonizing is very easy. You can just do black and white. But if you have these people in shades of gray already, then it's harder to use them in these sort of divisive ways. And of course, as you said, that is what they were, human beings. I mean, they were not perfect by any means, but they were truly extraordinary. That's why we're still sitting here, talking about all these centuries later.
Yeah, I think your next book is Aurangzeb.
Next to next. Next.
No, thank you. So this is a perfect setup actually for the last sort of set of issues I want to deal with, which is really the politics. So you distinguish between nationalist histories and politically motivated ones. I might say that one is really the other, just that your political project happens to be nationalism. So you have the convenience of perhaps an imperial enemy, a clear external enemy against which you are creating this. And one can read a lot of maybe early type of Nehruvian mold history in that grain. So people like Akbar emerge as central figures there. The current, the Hindutva history is a different kind of politically motivated history. It's an incomplete nation, and so it seems to us as if it is, and the enemy is within. So that's of course a very important difference, and perhaps similarities exist in Tamil nationalism too. So do you see a role for this kind of history writing? And you may not be setting out to do that necessarily, but now that it is out there, a role in actually enabling us to come to terms in a productive way with our history. And I'm putting it that way because, I don't want to sort of say that these are only stories that don't matter, right? That they're very tied to people's identities in many different ways. So we want them to work or do some work. We just don't want them to do the work of destroying, society. So do you see a role for this in enabling people to work better with history, making them better consumers of history?
Yes, and I think my answer lies in your question also, which is, okay, we are writing the history, but how it is received is up to all of you, all the readers. So a reader can read the book and come to his or her own conclusions, right? So that is out of our control. So I was just very neutral, I don't like Rajaraja, I don't dislike him. I just tried to be detached from the whole thing and just try and put myself into that time and place and set of circumstances and see why he might have done what he did. So, and I hope that comes through in the book also. Whether somebody reads it and chooses to look at it as anti-national or anti-Tamil, I can't. And people have said that, why have you said that he's brutal and why have you said this? I said, well, he was, but he was that because that was the way things operated in that way. But I think one thing nice about these non-historians, there's a lot of very nice history being written. I think many of us are just kind of trying to be neutral and just present the facts as we know them, and it's the interpretation of that is up to the reader. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I didn't set out to demonize or aggrandize Rajaraja. I just tried to be very sort of detached from that perspective and then just write what he did. And I think the story speaks for itself, really.
No, and how you put it very well, Amit, and I think perhaps another difference between sort of the Nehruvian nationalist history and this sort of new Hindutva style of history is that history, whether by force of circumstance or because of the way that it was imagined, happened, in colleges, universities, books, etc. A lot of this is happening on WhatsApp and YouTube, and where you have these kind of completely unverified claims that make that are disseminated very, very quickly and arouse these great feelings of resentment and anger. And I think part of what I enjoy about writing history, and part of what I try to bring into the books also, is that it is possible to live with contradictions. It's not, we don't have to pick sides. And so again, for another small example, but it's the death of Hemu, whom Akbar actually doesn't. Akbar is about 13, 14 years old in the second battle of Panipat. He doesn't actually come to the battlefield. It's his the rest of the army, particularly Uzbek general, who are fighting against Hemu. And I think most of you will know the story that Hemu is a very, very successful, very talented general, and he is about to win. It really looks like the Mughals will lose and will have to, they've only just arrived across the Indus, they may well have to go back. And then there's this chance arrow that flies through the air and hits him in the eye, and he falls, he dies. I mean, he's wounded, he doesn't die. And later on, the battle immediately turns, and later on he's captured, and by this time, Akbar and Bairam Khan have arrived, and they established a kind of makeshift camp, and Hemu is brought, and Bairam Khan says to this Akbar, who is a boy at this time, he says, you behead him. And he gives him his sword. And now Abul Fazl says that he did not. Akbar refused, and Bairam Khan insisted that you must do it. And Akbar, the more he insisted, in fact, the whole sort of assembly started saying, no, you have to do this. You are the king. But Akbar would not. And in fact, Abul Fazl even adds a little coda saying how he wishes that Akbar at that time had come out from behind his veil. And this is Bairam Khan's metaphor for Akbar not really taking charge of things, and kept Hemu alive because he was such a talented man and how much he could have contributed to the empire. Jahangir, in the Jahangir Nama, also says that his father did not kill Hemu. In fact, and he adds a little detail that he says presumably this is how Akbar used to tell it to him. He said, I didn't do it because I said that when I was in Kabul the previous year, I had drawn a picture of Hemu on a piece of paper and torn it up. So already I had metaphorically killed him, so there was no reason for me to literally kill him now. Then there's a later historian, Vincent Smith, who's a colonial historian, who, while he agrees that Akbar is a fairly extraordinary man who's done extraordinary things, does not like him at all. I mean, it's really very, very, like you can feel him bristling when he writes about him. And he says with great authority, though I'm not entirely sure based on what, that he is sure that Akbar did kill Hemu. And so Vincent Smith, you could say, well, he has an evident and clear bias, against Akbar, so perhaps that's why he's saying it. But then, then I found that Harvansh Mukhia, who's a very well-known modern historian, has also written that he believes that Akbar did, in fact, behead Hemu. And he doesn't actually give a reason, but then I don't know who am I to question Harvansh Mukhia? He must have reasons for saying this if he's saying it. So now I don't feel the need when I'm writing this to say, okay, this is true and that is not true. I've put all, sort of 4 versions in there, and I don't even know if it's necessary for anyone to decide. The readers don't even necessarily have to choose any of these particular explanations. They are, and this is, of course, this is a question of, interpretations can intermingle and change all the time. This is even in terms of facts. Sometimes you can have facts that contradict each other, but they don't have to be, it doesn't have to be taken to heart in this way. It is something that this is part of what reading and writing history involves, is not always knowing, everything for sure. And certainly not, getting emotional about, or emotional about it in the way that seems to be like, now sometimes it seems as if, our elections are being fought in the 16th or 17th century. That is, it brings no benefit to us.
No, you're absolutely right. History in life is messy, chaotic. History is messy and chaotic. It should not be black and white, black or white, or good or bad. It's black and white, good and bad. It's all part of the thing, and it's wonderful. You said you give all the interpretations, and that's how it is. There's nobody was there to see what actually happened. So, in telling these stories, that also tells you something about the people who tell the stories and people who receive those stories and the people about whom the stories are told. So it's all part of the history, actually. And it's wonderful that these things are coming out, that we're not just, there's not one story about Rajaraja and Akbar and Jahangir, but many, and they're all part of his thing, so.
Thanks. We're almost running out of time. So one last quick comment I'll get from you and then open it up. To add some more political complexity to it, in the north there is the whole Hindutva context, which is large. In the south there is a Hindi imperialism context, which is related. And what sometimes happens is, from an opposition to that politics, you are forced to construct these ideal types again. So actually some very valuable regional anti-imperial resistances that perhaps you would support from freedom-loving side, you neglect because the imperial powers become the modern underdog in a very weird kind of twist of fate.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing happens with the Cholas and Hindi imperialism. So now to resist Delhi is to valorize these guys who are not particularly worth valorizing, and to resist Hindutva is to praise Akbar, who is again very complicated guy. I want to sort of 2-minute bite on, is there a way out of this weird taking of sides that, has to be done?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I think, you're right in a sense that, so this is actually, and because, I would have to be living under a very, very large boulder to not realize how politically suspect the Mughals are at this time. And as it happens, it's from 2015 onwards that I've been writing about them. And, with every passing year, they become more and more, villainized and demonized. So, of course, I'm aware of that. But I'm also aware that the Mughals are long dead and gone. Nothing that anyone says about them now makes any difference to them. These are political attacks that have a political target in the here and now. Mughals are just a way of saying a Muslim, and so it's got nothing really to do with the Mughals. And so when writing, I don't, although, because there's so much of this attack going on, you go into a kind of defense mode, but I try to resist that, because I'm not Akbar's lawyer, and I think the joy of writing about someone like him or someone like Jahangir is actually exploring all the grays, not just writing sort of a hagiography or a defense. There's no reason for me to defend him. And as to your, and again you're right, the focus, of course it would also be nice to write about the times, or about ordinary people and all of that, which also it's more difficult to find, particularly for non-historian, that to discover what lay people or normal people were up to, but wherever I can find some kind of sources for that, I do, because I think that helps. That's part of the world. We're trying to create a detailed world that is alive, and this that helps to do it. Like, for example, there's this poet here, contemporary of Akbar, young trader called Banarsi Das, who at one point is very bad at trading but loves writing poetry and is therefore reduced to living off kachoris that he has borrowed and taken on loan from a kachori wala in Agra. So those kind of details I do try to...
This is the Ardh Kathanak. If anybody wants to look it up, it's been translated, I think. Or not translated.
Beautifully translated, yes. Penguin...
Last word.
Okay, so I'm from Tamil Nadu, and we have quite a crazy mindset over there that Tamil Nadu and Tamil is this pure thing, untainted by anything from anywhere else, and nothing could be further from the truth. All of human history is connected. Human beings have been traveling and being influenced by people near and far throughout our history. And so it is with Tamil Nadu. So I was very pleasantly surprised to find that even in Rajaraja's time, somehow part of his validation was linking himself to the Vedic world, the Sanskrit world of North India. And they kept saying that, our priests come from there, and I'm descended from this history that is not Tamil history at all. And one of the Chola ancestors I was fascinated to find, it was a king. It's in their genealogy, so they list all the people that they've descended from, starting from the sun, and then a bunch of kings, and semi-mythological kings, actual kings. So one of the kings was somebody called Shibi Chakravarti, who is actually from Baluchistan in Pakistan. And, there's a whole story about his heroism. He was a very just king, and apparently two gods one day decided, Indra and Agni, decided to test his sense of justice. So one flew down as a dove, and the other flew down as a hawk. And the dove came first and said to Shibi and said, please save me. This hawk is trying to kill me and eat me. You need to save my life. So Shibi says, don't worry, I will save you. And he cradles the dove in his lap. A minute later, the hawk comes down and he says, hey, what about my food? You've deprived me of my meal. And the king realizes that, yes, he has a point too. So he says, I'll carve out a piece of flesh that is equal to the weight of the dove. And therefore, the dove is saved and the hawk gets to eat. So he keeps gouging out his flesh, and it never equals the weight of the dove, and there's this growing pile of flesh there and blood, and this guy is in agony, but he says, I have to keep my word, and he keeps gouging out more and more flesh. And eventually the gods reveal themselves for who they are, and then they say, yes, you are truly a just king, and it all ends happily ever after. But this king originates in Pakistan, and somehow the Cholas have piggybacked onto his story and made him part of their ancestors. And there is a theory that the Indus Valley civilization, when it was threatened, it moved down to southern India, and there's a whole lot of scholarship going on now that find links and connections linguistically, sociologically, and even this mythologically between the deep south of South India and Pakistan. Who would have ever thought of this connection, right? So to say that Tamil and Tamil history is pure and untainted by anything outside its immediate core is, again, reducing it to nothing, So you need to accept all these. So Tamil purists don't like to accept that there are Sanskrit elements. Rajaraja is not a Tamil name. Nataraja, which was their main god, is derived from Sanskrit, the god of dance. Rajendra, many of their names are Sanskritic names, not pure Tamil names at all. So they need to accept that. This is true. Nothing is pure, nothing is untainted. Taint is a bad word, but I'm hoping these histories will open minds and hearts to the grandness of history, really, rather than the smallness of it.
Thank you. Sorry, I think we've gone way over. Can we take one or two questions?
Yes.
Actually, what I find interesting about both of you is that you have come into history from not the academic profession, but you've come from the corporate world, you've come from literature. So that must be one of the reasons why your point of view is so interesting. But I just have a question. How are the academics taking your take? I mean, the pure academicians. Do they appreciate these interventions? And another question just linked, you can pick up, is that have you looked at the textbooks now? They are changing because of this Hindutva ideology. Because, for example, the Mughals now in Maharashtra, I was reading, have become one chapter almost, and equal weight of the whole Mughal dynasty is Shivaji. So there's obviously a rewriting going on, and this reappropriation of history at the school level I find frightening. Because you people are not coming to history, you come with an open mind. But a child who's been brought up in this kind of a warped way of looking at Mughal history would really think that they're not so important as, say, one chapter of one character. So just, these are just observations, not really questions. Thanks.
Do you go? I mean, I'll try to answer your first question. My book was very recently released, and most of my sources were academic sources, so if any academic has some quibble with it, they have to find fault with themselves, I guess. So I don't know what, they have not had much to say as yet. And I don't live in this country, so about the history syllabus and stuff, I think it's a real shame if we are kind of, distorting things and emphasizing one aspect more than another. I don't like it. It is wrong. And also we shouldn't think of, I mean, we're talking about inclusivity and diversity and things like that. We shouldn't think of histories like Chola history as a regional history or a local history. It is your history too. It is Indian history. So we should include all the histories of all parts of India. And I don't know how you kind of teach all of that, but I feel syllabuses should be inclusive. That is very, very important. And without any, we just present it as it is. And let the children, when they grow up, let them make up their minds about what they think. But to seed a certain way of thinking is wrong.
Who said education is power? So they want to think.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with what Kamini said. It's one thing to include more. I mean, increase the chapters on different dynasties or kings or regions if it is felt that they have not gotten their due. But this is not an inclusive process. This is an excluding process. That we will get rid of these guys and show them their place, and then somehow only that will allow space for other stories to be told. And I don't know what the effects of it will be, but I have to say I am. Following the release of Akbar, I found myself in many conversations with a lot of young and usually completely not a non-historian, social media handles, often Instagram. I mean, I'm sure you've also had some conversations with them. They're fantastic. They're all very, very young kids, usually just in college, maybe a little bit out, with this very, very engaged interest in history, very, very greatly enjoying the complications of history, not looking for simple black and white answers. So that gives me a lot of, I've really enjoyed these interactions that I've had. And I think more and more as the attacks on history or the politicization of history grows, so people are perhaps taking it into their own hands, and trying to understand it for themselves. So that may be a sort of silver lining there.
Right. I'm so sorry to cut this short, but Amit sir has his session in the next hall. So I think it's very important for him to leave as of now. But I'm so happy that this was a very educative session. I'm sure everybody agrees here. And thank you so much to our panelists for being here and engaging in such a beautiful and interesting conversation. I'm sure you're going to buy all of their books at Crossword at a very, very nominal rate. Thank you so much for being here. And big round of applause, everybody. Thank you.